Okay, in this video clip, we're going to continue our story of how microbes cause disease. So we're moving on to step 4. So our microbe has entered, it has established itself in the body. We've talked about the different ways that a microorganism may have available to get around the immune system, the early forces of the immune system. And now we've actually got to cause the disease. We've got to damage the host in some way. And we'll spend a couple of video clips talking about this. In this one, we're going to talk about exoenzymes and exotoxins as two things that microorganisms can produce to damage the host. Now, first of all, just a kind of an overview of host damage. Again, if you're not being damaged by a microorganism, then it's not really truly pathogenic. It's not causing a disease, because a disease is a change from a state of health. So if you're not being harmed, you're probably still pretty healthy. So the damage, as we'll see, can be caused by the microbe itself, or it can be caused by the immune response. So the immune response, the immune system, as we'll see when we get into the last unit for the course, contains a lot of very powerful weapons. Some of those weapons are cells that kind of act like soldiers and go around and torpedo things to destroy them. And other things are things like antibodies, and there are other chemicals that are produced by your immune system that are meant to damage things that are foreign to your body, but sometimes there's collateral response that the damage from an infectious organism occurs. Now, when it's being caused by the microbe itself, sometimes it's direct damage by the microbes. The microbes are secreting enzymes into their surroundings, and they're digesting tissues. Now, we talked a little bit about that in the previous video clip. We talked about how microorganisms may release enzymes that help them digest their way through barriers so they can gain access deeper into the body. And so those are some examples of exoenzymes. What is this exo or fatty acids, things like that? So some of the exoenzymes are involved in feeding, but that feeding process can also damage us. All right, and then indirectly, microbes can produce toxins, which are secreted, and they're not enzymes, so they're not breaking things down as part of digestion, but they nevertheless have harmful effects on the body. And so we'll talk about bacterial toxins in two categories. One are exotoxins, and another will be endotoxins. So exo here again means that's something that's secreted. It exits the bacterial cell, and then it can float away and diffuse away through your body fluids and get into the bloodstream. Endotoxins are, remember how we talked about the lipopolysaccharides in the gram-negative outer membrane back in chapter 3? I mentioned that was going to come back up again when we got to a later point in the semester, and so here we are. So the lipid part of the lipopolysaccharide in a gram-negative bacterial organism's outer membrane functions as what we call endotoxin. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. If you have toxins in your bloodstream, that is called toxemia. So the emia suffix here is referring to things being in the blood. So if you have bacteremia, you have bacteria in the blood. If you have viremia, you have viruses in the blood. All right, so a little bit more about these exoenzymes. So again, these are enzymes, and these are generally going to be digestive enzymes that are secreted by bacteria into their surroundings so that they can break down larger organic molecules into their smaller building block substances. And again, some of these are just being used for feeding, but some of them can be used to help combat the immune system or break down barriers. So a couple of examples of these. Mucinase is an enzyme that is secreted by amoeba species. Amoebas are protozoans, so single-celled eukaryotes. And so there are amoebas that cause dysentery, which is a very severe, it's kind of like a bloody, severe diarrhea. Not something that would be very pleasant to have. But mucinase is an enzyme that helps break down the mucus that's located along the inside lining of the intestinal tract. And then we've talked a little bit already about flesh-eating disease. Streptococcus pyogenes is a species of bacteria. There are some strains of that cause flesh-eating disease. So more typically, we think about this organism as causing strep throat, but there are strains that are a little bit genetically different that are capable of causing flesh-eating disease if you are unfortunate enough to develop an infection with that. So flesh-eating, we've talked about this before, flesh-eating disease is called necrotizing fasciitis. So the enzymes that digest and liquefy tissues as part of that disease process are called necrotizing enzymes. So there are many examples of exoenzymes that can be secreted by microorganisms, and those contribute to the damage that we experience. All right, now how about exotoxins? Okay, so these aren't going to be digestive enzymes. These are going to be toxic for other reasons, as we'll see. So, all right, so when we're talking about exotoxins here, the examples we're going over are all bacterial. So associate exotoxins with pathogenic bacteria and not other types of microorganisms. So again, here's a diagram from your textbook which is showing an exotoxin. Exo, again, the toxin. Now these are proteins, they're protein molecules, but they get secreted outside the cells. And then what they do is they can travel through your body fluid, so they'll get into the bloodstream, the blood can carry them to other parts of the body. So these exotoxins can have effects very, very distant, a great distance away from where the bacteria are actually located. All right, and a good example of a bacterial exotoxin that we've all heard about before, Clostridium tetani, which causes the disease tetanus. That is caused when this organism establishes an infection in the body. Now, hopefully you remember that the Clostridium genus consists of obligate anaerobic bacteria. Okay, so most parts of your body are very well perfused with oxygen gas. So this organism can't survive in most parts of the human body because it's an obligate anaerobe. All right, now you've probably heard about the old story about if you step on a rusty nail, you might get tetanus. And that is actually true. There are anything that punctures the skin, you know, some sort of parenteral route of entry like that. And this organism is present in a widespread way out in the environment. So it's not, you know, it's pretty easy to wind up getting Clostridium tetani into your body. But if you step on something like a rusty nail, that's going to set up a little small area of dead tissue in there. So a little bitty area in there around that puncture wound is a place where Clostridium tetani can actually grow because it's a small area of anaerobic tissue. So those bacteria are not really directly harming you, but Clostridium tetani releases a protein toxin, an exotoxin called tetanospasmin, and that gets into your body fluids. It enters the bloodstream. The blood carries it throughout the body. And this tetanospasmin or tetanus toxin causes, now you've probably heard of tetanus being called lockjaw before. So what this toxin does is it interferes with this communication that goes on between motor neurons and your skeletal muscle fibers. Remember that from Biology 201. And basically what it does is it prevents skeletal muscle fibers or muscle cells from relaxing. So they wind up being locked into a contracted state, a state of tetany. Maybe you remember that term from Biology 201 as well. And the symptoms generally first appear in the smaller facial muscles, and so that's where the name lockjaw comes from. Unfortunately, if you don't treat this tetanus infection, it will begin to paralyze or lock muscles throughout the body in a contracted state. And when your diaphragm contracts, locks down into a contracted state, you're not going to be able to breathe anymore, and that's going to wind up killing you if you're not treated for tetanus. So that's a good example of a bacterial exotoxin. Other bacterial exotoxins go inside cells and wind up killing those cells. So they're actually showing you an example here of some generic bacterial organism that secretes an exotoxin that kills host cells, and this organism is likely using that toxin to help break through an epithelial tissue so it can gain access deeper in the body. Okay, so bacterial exo. Now here we're going to start getting into some information that's not really covered in your textbook, so you're going to want to take good, thorough notes. But bacterial exotoxins can be classified in a couple of different ways. They can be classified according to the body location where they cause problems. And so that terminology that gets used is cytotoxin, cyto referring to cells. So that's a bacterial exotoxin that can go inside many types of cells and causes those cells to die. Enterotoxins would be a type of bacterial toxin that affects the intestinal tract or the gastrointestinal tract. Usually entero refers to your intestines. Then a neurotoxin is going to be a toxin that acts on the nervous system. So up here, this tetanospasmin, that protein that's made by Clostridium tetani, is an example of a neurotoxin because it's interfering with proper communication between your motor neurons and skeletal muscle fibers. So that's one way that bacterial exotoxins can be classified. Another way is based on how they function. And so there are three major types: AB, membrane disrupting, and superantigens. So we'll talk a little bit about what those are. So a number of bacterial exotoxins fall into the AB category. And just kind of in a nutshell here, A stands for action or activity, and B stands for binding. So these are proteins, protein exotoxins. And what this means is this protein toxin has two parts. So this is supposed to be the protein exotoxin of some evil pathogenic species of bacteria. And the A part is going to have activity. The B part is going to bind to the host cell. And I like this diagram because they're showing you it's a protein. So the bacterial organism that makes this has to have a gene on its DNA that codes for this exotoxin. And so you got to go through transcription and make the messenger RNA and then go through translation to actually make the exotoxin protein. So if a bacterial organism doesn't have the gene for this exotoxin, it's not going to make the exotoxin. And it's not unusual for these exotoxin genes to be present on plasmids, those little extra pieces of DNA that can get spread from one cell to another through conjugation, if you remember that from back in chapter 8. All right, so this is some evil pathogenic type of bacteria that secretes an AB exotoxin. The B part of the toxin attaches to some sort of receptor molecule on the surface of a host cell, kind of like a virus would attach to a host cell, same kind of concept. Then notice that the host cell internalizes this AB exotoxin, kind of like it would internalize other things that might bind to the surface. Comes inside in a little membrane-covered vesicle. The A part of the exotoxin comes off, and this is the action part. And generally what these do is they inhibit protein synthesis, so they shut down protein synthesis in the host cell. If a host cell can't make its proteins, guess what? It's going to die pretty quickly. And so that's how these toxins tend to kill our host cells. Kind of nasty. A good example of an exotoxin that fits into this category is the diphtheria toxin produced by Corynebacterium diphtheriae or diphtheriae. So this is an organism. There are strains of this organism that make the toxin and strains that don't. So if you get it, you've got to be exposed to the pathogenic form in order to develop diphtheria. And so what this toxin does, kind of like we saw over here, it goes inside your cells if you're unfortunate enough to be infected with this organism, inhibits protein synthesis, and kills the cells. And so this goes on in the pharynx, back in the back of the throat. And so many cells get killed by this toxin that they kind of start to slough off, and you've got inflammation going on, so you've got all this mucus being produced and so forth. And all that stuff kind of gels together and forms something that's called a pseudomembrane or false membrane that forms back here in the back of the pharynx. And if it becomes tough enough and grows enough, it can cut off the airways and can actually suffocate the patient. I just read now everybody gets vaccinated for diphtheria in this country, unless you're one of those people who doesn't believe in vaccinating your children. And so this really, rarely causes any infections or deaths in the United States anymore. But interestingly enough, just this morning, I saw an article, and I'm recording this video at the end of June in 2015, where Spain just had its first death in a child from diphtheria in a very long time, and it was from somebody who was not having their children vaccinated. So get those vaccinations. It's very important to prevent all these nasty childhood diseases that don't need to harm your kids. Okay, so now some bacterial exotoxins are membrane damaging toxins, and we already talked about some of these in the last video clip. Remember the sidins, leukocidins, attached to white blood cells, poke holes in the membrane and kill them. We talked about the hemolycins that cause red and white blood cells to burst. Streptolysins, these are proteins that insert themselves into the membranes of many different cell types and cause those cells to wind up dying because of that. So these are, remember I mentioned that there's a lot of hole punching that goes on, so these are some more examples of bacterial proteins that can poke holes in the membranes of our cells. And when we get into the immune system, we'll see examples of where our immune system has hole punching weapons that poke holes into the membranes of their cells. So it's a pretty common strategy in the war that goes on between us and them. So streptolysins are produced by the Streptococcus pyogenes strains that cause necrotizing fasciitis. Now we also talked about how the strains of this organism that cause necrotizing fasciitis produce exoenzymes. So there's more than one thing that they're producing to cause that nasty flesh-eating disease. This is kind of a gross picture of a chunk of tissue from somebody who has a flesh-eating disease infection, and what this is trying to show you is that the organisms that cause flesh-eating disease produce these toxins and digestive enzymes, and they can damage many different layers of tissue. So it includes the epidermis, the dermis, down in the subcutaneous tissue, and then even deeper to there, getting down into the skeletal muscle layer as well. So pretty nasty stuff. All right, the third functional type of bacterial exotoxin is called a superantigen. So when we study the immune system in the last unit, antigens are molecules that your immune system responds to. So they're generally complex molecules like proteins and carbohydrates. And your immune system responds to those types of molecules, and it's supposed to respond to things that it sees as foreign to your body. A superantigen is something that a foreign molecule that triggers your immune system to overreact, react in a very severe way. And a really good example of a superantigen bacterial exotoxin is produced by Staphylococcus aureus. So this is a pathogen in the Staphylococcus genus, comes up a lot in a microbiology class. And this causes a number of cases of food poisoning. So if you've ever had the type of food poisoning where you eat something and a few hours later you're puking your guts up, probably shooting stuff out from both ends of your digestive tract, and you generally feel miserable, but then you get over it in a few hours, you're no longer having those types of symptoms. Of course you feel horrible because you're totally dehydrated and it takes a while to recover. But it's that's a type of food poisoning that's very quick. And a lot of times that is caused by Staphylococcus aureus exotoxin because it is a super antigen. And so what happens is the Staphylococcus aureus bacteria grow in food. So some food that you ate, like maybe you were at a picnic and there was some food sitting out in the warm sun, bacteria, these Staph aureus bacteria reproducing and secreting this exotoxin. So the exotoxin is in your food. And then you swallow the exotoxin, and it makes its way through your stomach and on down into your intestinal tract. And then what happens is you've got cells of your immune system along that inside lining of the intestinal tract that overreact. They get overactivated, so they stimulate very severe inflammation. And when you have inflammation of the intestinal tract, you're going to have diarrhea and vomiting, lots of pain and so forth. So it's not the bacteria that are directly making you ill, it's this toxin that the bacteria made and released into the food that you ate. Okay, and so once you flush the toxin out of your body and it's no longer there, the symptoms will stop. The inflammation will decrease fairly quickly. So it's a rapid onset, but you get over it pretty quickly too, even though you're probably going to feel like you're going to die while you have it. So that's pretty common, Staphylococcus aureus food poisoning. I think I also, we've talked a little bit about how, now we all have Staphylococcus epidermidis. That's a species of Staphylococcus bacteria that we all have all over our skin, up your nose. Very common, very widespread. But some people have Staphylococcus aureus as part of their transient microbiota. And it's not unusual at all for it to live along the inside lining of your nasal cavity. Probably about 30% of you right now, maybe a little more, a little bit less, are what we call carriers of Staphylococcus aureus, and you probably don't even know it. So it's pretty easy for Staphylococcus aureus to get transferred into foods that are being prepared. And if those bacteria grow in the foods, they can secrete, there are strains that can secrete this super antigen toxin that can cause this type of food poisoning. All right, so super antigen, remember that's a functional category for a bacterial exotoxin. This is also an enterotoxin because that's a name that's telling us what part of the body it affects. It affects the intestinal tract. So if you've ever had the 24-hour flu, a lot of times when people say they've got the 24-hour flu, it's really this. You've had Staphylococcus aureus food poisoning. Pretty nasty thing to have. Okay, so another type of, some bacteria produce multiple types of exotoxins, and a good example is Bacillus anthracis, which causes anthrax. We've all heard of anthrax before. And unfortunately, this organism also produces endospores. So back in chapter 3, I think we mentioned Bacillus anthracis as a endospore-producing organism. And we all heard about the anthrax spores being sent in the white powder through the mail back after 9/11, 2001. And so inhalation anthrax, if you inhale those anthrax spores, they go down into the respiratory tract. And this graphic is showing you that here we go with beating the host defenses like we've been talking about. So your white blood cells will try to attack those spores, but they're not successful at really killing the anthrax bacteria that germinate from those spores. And then those Bacillus anthracis bacteria start releasing these exotoxins that spread throughout the body and cause widespread problems. So they'll cause hemorrhaging, they damage blood vessels, you'll have pulmonary edema, fluid that builds up in the lungs. Pretty nasty stuff. A lot of this is due to blood vessel damage. Also, this organism, there are anthrax toxins that overstimulate the immune system and can trigger shock throughout the body. You can have vasodilation that occurs throughout the body, which causes your blood pressure to go down. That's a good concept to learn. Vasodilation across the whole body, down goes your blood pressure. And if that's occurring across your whole body and in a severe enough manner, you're going to go into shock because you're not circulating blood properly to your vital organs, and that can ultimately kill you. So inhalation anthrax is almost always fatal. All right, and another example of a neurotoxin. So we just talked about Clostridium tetani and that tetanospasmin toxin that causes your skeletal muscles to lock into a contracted state. Kind of an opposite effect occurs with botulism toxin or botulinum toxin. So, or Botox. That's what we hear this called pretty routinely these days. So this is made by Clostridium botulinum bacteria. And all right, so how this works, if you guys remember from your Biology 201, this is a skeletal muscle cell or muscle fiber, and here's the axon of a motor neuron that's going to stimulate this muscle cell to contract. That axon has a number of branches off of it. And if we zoom in on where one of these axon branches is forming a junction with a skeletal muscle fiber. If you guys remember, this is called a synapse or synaptic cleft, because it's kind of digging down into the skeletal muscle fiber here. And in Biology 201, you guys learn that motor neurons secrete acetylcholine. That's a chemical that travels across this synapse or little gap here and stimulates the skeletal muscle cell to contract. So this is necessary in order for you to be able to contract your skeletal muscles. What botulinum toxin does is it prevents these little vesicles in here inside the motor neuron from traveling to the surface and releasing that acetylcholine chemical. So what this means is the communication between your motor neurons and your skeletal muscle cells is cut off. So the skeletal muscle cells don't receive any signals telling them to contract. So if you have a severe case of botulism poisoning, your muscles are not going to contract. You're going to kind of wind up in a limp ragdoll type state. So this is an extreme example over here. We have an infant who has very severe botulism, and you can see that essentially just like a limp ragdoll, because skeletal muscles won't contract. Can be fatal if not treated, because if you can't contract your diaphragm, you're not going to be able to breathe. Botulism can occur, and Clostridium botulinum, just like Clostridium tetani, is an anaerobe. So you can ingest the toxin from canned goods. Maybe you've heard before you're not supposed to eat canned goods if the can looks swollen, and in some cases when that occurs, you've got Clostridium botulinum bacteria growing in the anaerobic environment of that can, and it may be secreting that botulinum toxin, and you don't want to swallow that toxin because it could cause botulism. There are infant and wound forms as well. So infants have weaker immunity. As we all know, their immune systems are still developing. So if they eat something that has the Clostridium botulinum toxin in it, the Clostridium botulinum bacteria can actually colonize the colon, where it's an anaerobic environment. And if they do that, they can start producing this toxin that gets into the bloodstream, travels throughout the body, and can shut down this communication between the nervous system and your skeletal muscles. Not a good thing to have. There are also wound forms of botulism, kind of like with tetanus. If you get an anaerobic wound area where you've got enough damage that the blood supply is cut off to some of your tissues, and if Clostridium botulinum bacteria get in there, they can colonize and begin to produce that toxin. So kind of nasty stuff, but as you guys know, we hear about Botox today being used to relax the facial muscles, which helps reduce wrinkling in the face. And Botox also has some other useful, good uses. For example, I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here. For example, in treatment of migraines, migraines can be caused by tension in facial and cranial muscles, and so that's a good application of Botox, is to inject it into those areas to help with relaxing some of the muscles there that might be causing migraines. I've also heard that Botox is used to help, this is a completely different use, it doesn't really affect your skeletal muscles, but it can help reduce sweating in people who have a tendency to sweat too much. That's another treatment. Now when if you do get Botox treatments to make yourself look younger or to control migraines or whatever, they have to inject super tiny amounts of that Botox into the locations that need treatment, because the botulinum toxin is extremely potent. So I can't remember the exact amount, but there's some pretty tiny amount that could wipe out the entire human population of the earth if everybody got exposed to it. All right, so that was a pretty extensive little video clip talking about some exoenzymes can be produced by different types of microbes, and your textbook mentions some other examples as well. Then exotoxins, those are bacterial. Keep that in mind. All those examples we went over are produced by different types of pathogenic bacteria. In the next video lecture, we're going to continue on and we're going to talk about endotoxins of bacteria. Then we're going to talk about viral damage and how host defenses can actually be responsible to the damage that occurs when you have an infectious disease.